How dare you?
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
I did not have sexual relations with that woman.
Read my lips.
Hell yes, we're gonna take your AR-15.
It's waiting
I have a dream.
Thank you.
So, late in March this year, a video was released by North Korea, apparently showing the leader, Kim Jong-un, guiding the launch of a new type of intercontinental ballistic missile. The video can be be described as rather bizarre and comical, yet North Korea is a violent and seemingly volatile regime with nuclear weapons. So, that makes the issue a lot more serious. So, in our podcast, we therefore reach out to Professor Robert Huish from Dalhousie University in Canada, who's an expert on North Korea. Welcome to the pod.
Hi, guys. Pleasure to be here.
We got to know each other in New Zealand, staying at the same residential college in Dunedin, and Bob, I might say, because that's, I said your name was Robert, but I always knew you as Bob.
Bob.
You even introduced me to curling, which was a fun time, and on one occasion you gave a talk about North Korea and sanctions on the regime, and I still seem to remember that you pointed out that a Norwegian insurance or shipping company was involved in black market trading with North Korea. So, that's kind of intriguing. But first off, can you just tell us about, what's the current state of North Korea and the Kim regime?
Current state in North Korea is it's been a busy pandemic for Kim Jong-un. This year, 2022, we're seeing some things we haven't seen in a few years, such as North Korea starting to put projectile missiles up into the sky, and we're starting to see some jockeying of power within the South China Sea, with now a U.S. Aircraft carrier now entering international waters to try to protect and broker some of the tensions that are going to escalate between North Korea, South Korea, and Japan. So the video of Kim Jong-un overseeing the missile launch shows two things. One is that North Korea is able to reestablish its trade networks that it needed to engage in this belligerence for the past decade, because those got deeply interrupted during COVID. And second, it shows that North Korea has now mastered the art of iMovie, or whatever kind of low-budget film production that they're now going for. It used to be the Korean propaganda was very staunch. It was just reminiscent of the 1960s. And now, somebody's got a hold of some new software and they've made it a little bit more goofy. But that's important when you deal with North Korea, is it's always been this method of being scary as hell and really goofy at the same time. And how that works is it plays out in two ways. First is that there is always a threat of some hostile reaction from North Korea to its neighbors, mostly South Korea and to Japan. And Japan in particular, because Japan is, of course, within its constitution, cannot engage in war unless exactly provoked. So North Korea likes to bully Japan quite a bit. And there's all sorts of cases we can get into, from even kidnapping people right off the beaches in Japan. But what we see here is that there's this threat of aggression, and it can come by the way of missiles. It can come by the way of smuggling. It can come, again, by kidnapping. It's been a choice in the past. But it's usually coupled very, very quickly, and North Korean media is very well trained to do this, by something goofy and bizarre. They knew that video was going to look hilarious to the West, and that way the West wouldn't really take it seriously. Meanwhile, inside North Korea, anytime that there's action about missiles or weapons that are being showcased, that's a demonstration to the elite in Pyongyang that North Korea is fully in charge of itself and that the world respects it. And it's basically the same old song that's been going on for decades within the Kim dynasty. But COVID sort of interrupted things a little bit. It's a country that relies on very complicated trading networks in order to acquire the resources that it does. And when there's interruptions to that, their big narrative sort of falls apart. And we've seen that even though that North Korea is one of the world's most heavily sanctioned nations, there's loads of holes in it. And lots of countries get called out routinely for sanctions violations, including our pals in New Zealand, in fact, a couple of years ago.
So is this a show of strength? This, this missile launch, is that just for internal and external purposes, or is it mostly internal?
Yeah, it's two. So the first thing is there's the old generation, which is the referred term in North Korea, of those who actually remember the Korean War or who were just born after it. North Korea was effectively bombed to the Stone Age, as it was one of the U.S. generals said, and there's still memories of that. And the propaganda since Kim Il-sung was that the place and programs of missiles and counter weapons is what keeps those bombs from coming back. And there's lots of propaganda inside to keep that going. Now, that only appeals to a very small crowd, those in Pyongyang. People outside of Pyongyang have a tough life, and many are categorized as being hostile towards the government to begin with. So you have a governance structure in North Korea where about 10% are considered to be loyal and elite. They sort of get access to the capital, a la the Hunger Games. And then you sort of have the wavering classes, about 35 to 40% of the population, who may be in the military, but who lack a lot of resources, lack a lot of freedoms and abilities. And then you have the hostile classes, which exist more towards the border with China and outlying areas. And these are farmers who can barely make ends meet because there's no fertilizer, there's constant shortages, there's constant hardships. And when you have a country that governs itself by categorizing half of its population as hostile, you've got a problem. So that's a symbolic tool to use that missile. But at the same time, North Korea realizes that the way that it keeps power within its own country is through fear and repression. And if other countries start choking off its ability to do that, if it's missiles, that's one thing. If it's setting up prison camps, it's another thing. But if those resources get pinched in any way, there's going to be a reaction. And that's why there's this intimidation in this sort of chess game that North Korea plays with Japan, South Korea, and the United States, and at times even China, to annoy their pals in Beijing, and even Moscow to annoy their pals there too. It's always about position and strategy to get what they need to keep that old system, which in Korean is called songbun, alive and well. Songbun is like a feudal system. There's a deep class divide in North Korea, and they like it like that. Well, the Kims do, at least.
Is this strategy working in any ways? Is it sort of productive, given the goals of the regime?
Yeah, I guess in a sense, it's kept the place going since the 1950s. And even if you roll it right back to the early days of the Korean War, it was Kim Il-sung, who received orders from Stalin to say, don't invade South Korea, just don't. And they're like, seems to be a lot of the Stalin supporters in Eastern Europe are starting to tumble. If I invade South Korea, that might save my own skin. And he did that. And away he went, and then came about this cult of personality that came with it, which again was right out of the Stalinist playbooks from the 1940s. That's exactly how the puppet leaders in Poland and Hungary and East Berlin were all set up. You create a cult of personality around you and you govern through fear. They've kept that playbook going since the early 1950s, and they haven't deviated. Around the early 2010s, there was some suggestion that Kim Jong-un might bring in some market reforms, and they might become a bit more open to the world. We might see some more rudimentary free markets like in China or Vietnam, but not the case. And the reason for that is that it's not in a position to really open itself up to the international community on two fronts. One is because the human rights violations in North Korea are so insane that the top brass would have to be courted out to The Hague and put on trial. And secondly, you've got this cult of personality that deeply transcends the educational system, the work culture, and the military in North Korea that does not easily allow North Koreans to sort of accept how the rest of the world goes. It's not an open environment, and it's not one open to a lot of ideas. Basically, most of the outside world is presented to North Korea through smuggled materials, usually through Korean soap operas. And even then, a lot of North Korean defectors who even make it down to South Korea, they get there, they can't handle the culture shock. Like, that's it. Some go back, some go to Vietnam, some go back into China. But It's a very disconnected state of reality, and that's just how they've decided they're going to govern themselves.
But when the society is so secretive and so sort of closed to the rest of the world, what can we actually know about North Korea? How do we sort of? Is there any way to validate some of the information that comes out of North Korea, or is it? How does that actually work in practice?
That's a great point, and it's not an easy one to legitimately say, here's how it is. The problem with North Korea is that you're almost dealing with any sort of research methods about, how do you say, you're trying to research what you can't research. It's really, really difficult to back anything up. So there's sort of a few areas where experts go to get the details on this. Now, the first are those who've got access to military intelligence or government intelligence. So SIGINT is a big one. OPENT is another one. And then, you're looking at your visual intelligence as well. So a lot of traffic for satellite imagery is really important, understanding what goes on in North Korea, but you only get so much with that. You basically understand who they're trading with, what they're up to, and that's about it. Is this bridge open? Is that bridge closed? Is this port open? Is that port closed? That's it. And even then, it's really, really hard to make sure that data is clean, verified, and checked, and then it can be brought out. Secondly, we've got our pals in the diplomatic community, where there's a lot of deeper knowledge that goes on to try to get some information out through what Pyongyang has within its own diplomatic circles. So there are countries like Singapore and Malaysia, Russia recently, who do have working relationships with Pyongyang, and from there we're able to get a little bit more of all-point intelligence or all-source intelligence from what they have to say. For example, the work that came out of the Malaysian diplomats with the death of Kim Jong-un really solidified what was going on there, because we're like, how did this guy die? So their knowledge of that helped put it together, because they were in charge of actually repatriating his body. So we had to, we learned from them quite well. But the big thing for people who don't have access to that type of knowledge and information is to really look at the ripples that North Korea is making. It's difficult to say that this specific human rights violation took place on this specific day, on this specific time, because one, it's so profound, and two, a lot of people who are going to be able to testify to this are ones who have been able to leave North Korea, go through a real perilous journey to get to South Korea to then share their story. So there's a lot of handlers involved in that. There's a lot of people who help script their stories as well. But the thing is that, and others, some refugees that I've worked with, they've experienced trauma as kids, and there are details that are just blind spotted that they will not be able to recall. So you have to look at this very carefully and not look at an individual story, but look at the collection of stories. When you start to see the synthesis of these themes coming together, you may not be able to paint a perfect picture of what goes on in North Korea, because, again, a lot of
Our sound is gone again. I think.
How about that?
Yep.
My bad.
Yeah, now it's
We're
back.
back.
Sorry, guys. I'm having I think there's a driver conflict with my my mic. Let me take a look. Let me close a couple things here.
Technology.
Yeah. They updated the software on this mic, and it's been a pain. Okay, we closed some more stuff, so that should do it.
Yep.
No, but what I was saying is that you've got all these stories that are coming out of North Korea. The details are going to be erroneous, right? Down to the specifics. It's something that we've seen anthropologists struggle with in previous conflict zones, like in Guatemala. There's a famous case with Rigoberta Menchu's story being challenged over specific details, and you get that. But the UN has set up truth commissions for North Korea, and there's a lot of defector testimony that does come together and creates sort of a broader collage of what happens. So that's sort of how we deal with the human rights stuff. And in terms of the military and security stuff, That's harder. That is that's looking for the trails that North Korea leaves behind when it goes acquiring resources. And the amount of energy and research that goes into that is enormous. So you have to rely on like dedicated services like NK News, NK Watch, people who are getting up every day and just looking through these data sets to see what North Korea is up to. And it's not easy.
So, what just about the leader, we've seen a lot of talks also, about his position. Kim Jong-un, other family members. There's a sister there, isn't there? And we've been seeing some rumors about, possible takeover. But it's like from what you can gather, like what's the status of the regime right now?
So Mr. Kim has had some health challenges over the years. He's a very heavy smoker, very heavy drinker, and loves processed cheese. So they were actually worried that, he was getting some gout in his foot at one point, and he disappeared for a while. He's come back. He seems to have hit the gym a little bit, maybe cut down the smoking. So his health seems to be improved. But with the thing about the Kim tensions in the family is it comes back to what is a divide in the upper politique of North Korea. Those who say we are going to stay to the old way, this post-Stalinist approach to governance works for us. We're going to keep it. We benefit from it. Keep going. And then others say we are absolutely on thin ice, and it's only going to take a small domino to get an entire revolution going with inside. That crowd would like to see a little bit more diversity within its economy, within its trade partners. Don't forget, even Beijing, they put up with North Korea. North Korea is a pain in their ass. It's not in China's interest to have North Korea shooting rockets into the sky over Japan. That just escalates tensions in ways they don't want. So there are movements, I guess, within the governments, within their high officials to try to create change. But Mr. Kim is just not very open to it. And we've seen a lot of uncles and aunts and other high members of the government who appear one day at a parade and then we never see them again.
That's it's interesting, and that as you mentioned as well, that maintaining that personality cult for like so many years. I just recall going back to Belgrade in a few years ago and going to the the museums and the palace of Tito. And you saw the personality cult, but also how that country crumbled, when Tito was gone.
Oh, yeah.
But they and that's I guess a trademark of authoritarian regimes in a way. But you see in North Korea they've been able to maintain that, which is kind of fascinating, in a way too, that they've been able. But are they just very good at building personality cults? Is that the trick?
Well, they are. They've done a very good job of it over the years, and with three Kims that have come into power, all very different characters. Kim Il Sung was seen as this sort of protective father of everyone, but then again, in his era, he had Comecon. So when they ran short of resources, it was a quick call to Moscow and be like, "We need X," and it would eventually show up. There may be shortages of it, but it would eventually arrive. Kim Jong-il, he inherited the collapse. Now, in his reign, he saw 1.5 million people die of absolute hunger. Those are the best numbers that we have, but it was absolutely pure famine up and down in that country. And then from there, it was only beginning to build some trade networks with China, with Russia, and other states in Asia, notably Pakistan, that started to bring some economic development back. But even then, it only was limited to the capital. Now, since then, under Kim Jong-un's time, we've seen Pyongyang try to really push for this real flashy development of Pyongyang. They really want to make it like the next Dubai in terms of flashiness and lights and all this, but it's heavily restricted. You if you're a foreigner, you're on the little island inside Pyongyang, you're not going anywhere. There's 24-hour surveillance, all of this. And what they need to make that economy work is trade networks that are illicit, right? Ones that can hide sanctions. And the big difference is that in the old days, under Comecon and your Tito there in Belgrade, when the strongmen needed something, they could get it, right? Their partners would provide it. Well, now when you are the outsider and you need a resource, you've got to find partners in very shady areas, bring that network together, and then get it. The problem is they can do it, and they're running circles around what many countries have at their fingertips for sanctions enforcement. And some of the trade networks that North Korea has are wildly complicated. They are registering ships in Hong Kong and Singapore, flagging them in Solomon Islands and Seychelles. They're relying on European insurance companies to make those work. They're doing advanced spoofing, where there'd be a North Korean ship that would appear on the automatic identification system, tracking system. It'd be floating at sea, then suddenly it would pop up in Western Africa, and then it would pop back, and then it would be like 3 names deep by the time that anyone caught on to it. And then that ship has changed companies 3 times. Like, their ability to make a mockery of sanctions enforcement is hilarious. And it shows just really, really, really how little resources we actually have to put sanctions in a heavy hand to stop any sort of proliferation of nuclear material or weapons in that way.
So is that, because this is sort of, one of the most important, elements that we're going to talk about, and, sanctions, because we also see that now against Russia, and, sanctions,
Yep.
big, a lot of talk about sanctions. But, you talked about it, North Korea seems able to, run circles around these sanctions and find ways to work around it. Is that, but is that also because other countries or private companies or whatever are also willing to trade with North Korea? So that's a very lucrative way. And so that's one part of the question. And then the other one is just, does it also work because most countries don't really care about this issue?
Yeah, I mean, there are countries that are in a position right now to try to make what they can by offering services to countries like North Korea to help evade sanctions. And North Korea isn't the only one in this business. I mean, there's lots of tools, financial tools that are available that can help anybody, deviate from the norm if you want. So the big one is, the first one is setting up offshore shell companies. So when North Korea had a lot of its overseas finance parked was in Hong Kong, and then in Singapore was the other. So you would have these shell companies that would be set up that would own ships, and those ships on paper would look like they're owned and managed. They're owned in Hong Kong, they're managed in Singapore, both big shipping centers. I mean, no one's going to notice. And then from there, the third ticket that you need to have a ship at sea is a protection and indemnity insurance, to which there are loads of providers out there, even legitimate ones and fake ones. There's Norway, Skuld, I believe, is the one there, who's very famous for offering P&I insurance. But then there's like fake ones that were caught in Auckland, of all the places, and even in South Korea, they would set up these fake insurance firms. So if a ship pulled in, here's my ownership, here's my management, here's my P&I. What? And then on top of that, the flag of the ship could also be switched around. So roll it back 10 years ago, most of North Korea's trading fleet was tied up in was flagged in countries in West Africa. Burkina Faso was issuing flags to North Korean ships. Mozambique doing the same thing. Tanzania, I believe, was also big into that. And so people said, whoa, why are all these African ships floating around, Nampo Harbor? Oh, sorry. Cut those off, put them all on hold for a little bit, and then reflag them to new countries. And those countries are now in the Pacific. So countries like Kiribati is one, Seychelles is another, Tonga. Like, these are countries that have very, very minimal income, have a huge strategic interest by the amount of ocean that they occupy, and they're selling offshore flags to whoever wants to buy them. Now, how easy is this? Well, the answer is there's one building in Singapore where Kiribati has its offshore shipping licenses, is where you buy them from. 2 floors down, from that are where 3 of the North Korean shell companies are set up. So they're all in the same building. They're having lunch together. You know, you'd watch these guys. They'd be heading out to a night market in Singapore like it'd be nobody's business. But that's how quiet it can operate. And so when you're using these tools to get around it, if the U.S. wants to impose a sanction on North Korea on a particular boat, particular ship, it's hilarious because those can be switched. Well, you know, $20,000, $30,000 later, bang, it looks like a completely different vessel at sea. And even some of the sanctions that were put against Russia in the early days of the Ukraine invasion, they were following the same pattern. They're like, we're going to sanction these 4 guys and these 3 ships. Useless, right? That's not the way to do it. It's a sloppy form of sanctions.
But are there any ways to enforce sanctions effectively? Or will there always be possibilities of getting around it?
There's always going to be a way that people will try to avoid a sanction because it's so hard to enforce. So a lot of sanctions require the target to break a rule, and then the international community responds. So that's the old way of doing it. Now, some countries like Cuba have been heavily sanctioned for years, and the ones that were put in the early 1960s were completely ham-fisted. I mean, they just crushed everything in the Cuban economy as much as it could. In the 1990s, there were other sanctions that were put against Cuba that were thought then to be strategic, and here's the result of it. The first one that we could talk about is something called the Torricelli Act, which was a 1993 piece of legislation from Bill Clinton, that actually targeted food and medicine being imported into Cuba. Now, the problem with that is that, you know, it was already going through a pretty hungry period in Cuba, and now you're actually targeting humanitarian goods for that country. Now, that's ridiculous because the idea that you sanction a people, make them hungry, make them mad, and they're going to rise up and throw at the leader, that's never happened. We don't see strong, healthy democracies emerge from a lot of these ham-fisted sanctions. It just doesn't happen. The other one that came in, which was in 1995, called the Helms-Burton Act, didn't target Cuba directly, but it targeted the businesses that were dealing with Cuba. So if you were a Canadian airline sending flights down to Cuba, or a Canadian bank that had an office in Cuba, but you also had offices or dealings in the United States, your U.S. property could be seized, captured, and then you punished for dealing with Cuba. So that created this huge flight of capital out of Cuba during that time. But what it did is it just encouraged those outfits to open up shell companies somewhere else, subsidiary here, and have that subsidiary do no business with the U.S., if you follow me. So those are the 2 ways of kind of getting around it. Now, what we've seen with North Korea in terms of sanctions, but one of the most effective ones where it actually stopped the boats from moving, wasn't looking at trying to figure out where all the shell companies are being set up in Hong Kong and Singapore. And it wasn't going after the flags in the Pacific. And it wasn't going after the owners or the managers, but it was going after the protection and indemnity insurance. So in 2016, 2017, some reports came out that specifically identified the European insurers, the legitimate ones, who were insuring North Korean vessels. Now, I may have had a hand in writing some of that. And what effectively happened is that you had companies in Norway, in England, and in the Netherlands that were now getting served by the European Union, by the UN, to say, this vessel is known to be insured under your protection and indemnity club. You have to stop. You have to get them out right away. Otherwise, here's the fine that you're going to pay. We're talking like 150,000 euro fines were quickly issued. Statements were made. Those ships were contacted. They could not float. So sure enough, but North Korea pulled its ships out of those clubs, then found new clubs to put it in. So same deal happened with Iran, maybe in the early 2000s. Same idea. They stopped issuing insurance tickets for any Russian tanker or Iranian tanker to come out, and bang, the sea traffic stopped. But that's what it is. It's cat and mouse. One thing will stop something, and then there'll be a workaround, and something else will start. But those workarounds become expensive, they become costly, and you're not going to see any sort of progressive change come out of any country through just a pure sanction strategy. It's like fighting a war with a glass hammer.
But should sanctions be abandoned as a tool to sort of punish or to deal with these regimes, or are there any other tools that could be more could work better in any ways?
You know, sanctions should be part of the equation, but they need to be smart. So they need to look at what the governance, the governance pool, the leaders, what are they relying on to stay in power? And if those resources are compromised, we're seeing with Russia right now, they're trying to chase down their private jets and their yachts and all these sort of things amongst the oligarchs. So that's where the target is. But maybe some of the steel mills that these oligarchs own and operate, they're not being targeted because they're going to put workers out of business in places like Australia, Brazil, and Canada. Where we start to see the wheels go off the bus when it comes to sanctions is when they become too ham-fisted and they start making everyday people hungrier and angrier. What you don't see, what you haven't seen in any sanctions regime in the past 60 years is measures that target food, medicine, or the ability to work or to pay your electric bills or whatever it is. Something like that, seeing this boiling dissent come up from within and then overthrow the regime. So what sanctions need to have is to be very, very specific on who they want to put the financial hurt on. And secondly, they have to be coupled with something that allows for some sort of transition. And right now, there is no release valve. If it's in North Korea or if it's in Russia, about we're going to sanction you. We would like you to go away and no longer lead that country, but we don't know how to get you out. And that second step is what's really missing from the equation. And until then, it's just going to be whack-a-mole, cat and mouse, whatever board game it is that you're playing. That's what we're looking at.
So it has to be some kind of incentive for the regime to change to make the sanctions work.
Yeah, and that's something that maybe goes back into the playbooks from the 1960s when that was sort of offered. It's unpopular as hell because you're probably going to be putting a war criminal on a private jet and getting them out of the country. But could it change the scenario? I mean, is there so much in terms of human suffering that's going on there that is needed? Otherwise, do you go for full-scale war? And when you're dealing with countries like North Korea, who've got nuclear potential, I mean, nobody's prepared for that.
I think that's, it's endlessly fascinating, the first point about these companies making money with the ships or the boats here. And it's like, you have these companies then making money sort of contradicting the state sanctions and undermining the state sanctions. So you end up with a rather unfortunate position. But it's beautifully described, that cat and mouse game there. But then over back to the Russian argument or the Russian side here, because you do not want to escalate with NATO or other forces because the prospects of war is so horrific. But then so sanctions must, I guess, be a part of the equation, as you see, and they have to be smart sanctions. But let's just go back to that point and make it clear, I guess. So empirically, there is no evidence or data that shows that these sanctions that are hitting ordinary people, and sanctions that would hit ordinary Russians, that they would actually work. And because I've seen videos from YouTubers who has now fled to other countries because they can't get paid anymore, right? But then one of the guys did a video and he's like walking around in his home city, and you see 200-meter queue outside the ATM. Nobody's getting money. People are getting angry. You see the shelves in the supermarkets empty. People are also getting angry. So basically, what you're saying here is that empirically, there's nothing that indicates that this will actually work in making Russia change its course.
Right. I mean, again, rolling back the history of sanctions a little bit, when we see them imposed like this, there's no guarantee that people are going to side with the issuer of the sanctions. And in fact, that's rarely the case. And I'm thinking Cuba. In the early 1960s in Cuba, I mean, it was teetery. There were people who were really, really supportive of the revolution that was going on. I mean, it wasn't even declared a socialist revolution, just saying we just want better energy prices and kind of access to our own land. Beg your pardon. But after 1965, things changed. That's when, there was now this inability for people who disagreed with the regime to leave. And when that was cut off, and you now had people inside Cuba or outside Cuba, and there was no going back and forth, those who stayed became nationalists. They became proud as hell. And even though there was some lunacy policy that was imposed in Cuba in the 1970s, people stuck with it. And that ability to sort of off-vent the internal dissent went away. Ditto with other places, like, why are there heavily sanctioned nations like I'm thinking Myanmar, for example? Yes, there was a political turmoil a couple of years back, but military's back in charge, and we're not hearing a whole lot about it. You cannot guarantee that people will side with the issuer of sanctions, because that can be spun so quickly by the internal regime to say, see, it's the fault of the West. It's the fault of the international community. Stick with me. I'll protect you. And we hear that song from Venezuela to North Korea to Iran. Anywhere that's got heavy sanctions on it, you hear that song.
But then in relation to Russia now, so how do you see these sanctions play out in with Russia, and and the relationship, I guess, between especially the Western countries, but also Russia? Do you think the sanctions will work? Do you see need for different sanctions, or?
Yeah, I think they're going to need to really rejig some of the sanctions that have been imposed, because there's some of the initial ones that were offered were pretty gentle. I mean, the ones where they were putting penalties on U.S. Treasury debt and any U.S. assets within Russian banks, there was a 30-day window to move the assets in and out of, they were imposed on February 17th. You had until March 17th to basically clear your accounts and settle your debts. So whoever was making money on this did fine. I mean, Burger King is still operating there. They're proudly like, we will keep serving our terrible cuisine to the Russian people. So there's always little caveats that come with it. Where I think that you're going to see, the rising cost of everything in Russia is not going to produce any sort of sympathy to Western democracies. And that also compounds from the fact in the last, 15 years, you've had a media inside Russia that has been very obtuse to bringing in any sort of acceptance of Western democracy or Western morals. It's seen as being a corrupt system. It's a system that hasn't benefited Russia. There's more, supposed guidance in going with Russia's approach to international affairs than trying to rely on the West. And that is just going to be only furthered when people are paying more for the basics.
No, it will be interesting to follow it. I mean, it's a great test, I guess, also for sanctions, or in a way, and it's like how this is actually going to play out. But then, I also remember, in Dunedin, there was a lot of Iranian students living there, and they also, they weren't friends of the regime in Tehran, but they also didn't really appreciate the sanctions, just because it made life just a lot more difficult. And and I think one of the problems, the way that I saw it, is that it also closes the space for humans to actually, live their life or fulfill their potentialities. It's like you're down to basic survival, and in that sense, you're also more vulnerable to, the strong man.
Absolutely.
Or that personality.
Absolutely.
But
how do you pay for tuition in New Zealand or Canada if you're from Iran? You go back, you get a suitcase full of American dollars somehow, and you take a flight. That's it. That's literally how you pay your bills, because of the banking sanctions. And so when you put more and more of those inconveniences in, it's bizarre what the reactions are going to be. So, for example, telecommunications, if we go back to Cuba for a second, are heavily sanctioned. It's if you're in Cuba and you want to call U.S. or Europe, pick up a phone line and do it. It's going to be $2 a minute. So how do you actually do it? Well, there's a system set up now where if you're in the U.S., you can put money on a Cuban phone and they'll double the credit for it. So you put $20 on it, you get $40 in credit. It's a way of getting money into the country that again is illogical, but it's a survival skill.
That's really interesting. I'm looking at potential questions, and I'm also looking at the timer for the podcast. I'm saying,
Sure.
shit, this is gonna we need to do more episodes, I think. But I was, as the last question, I was just gonna ask you any crazy stories about your dabblings or your work with North Korea. Anything that shows how exciting a life of an academic can be. Someone who works in the right field.
Yeah, well, there's sort of there's one story that goes together, and this has to be one of the highlights that sort of brings the teaching and the research together. I was working in Seoul, talking with North Korean defectors. So these are people who have gone north through China and then through one of several routes to get to Bangkok, which is the first unguarded South Korean embassy where they can then be migrated to South Korea. And so we're talking about all the details and the stories. And the one guy says, if you really want to understand how human rights works, follow the money. And that just made me think, let's do it. And at the time, there was so much that was being focused on China providing aid to North Korea, but it didn't make sense in terms of why, missile hardware and rocket fuel and these sorts of things were coming in from China, because they're coming in through the sea. So we started looking at maritime security as a way of seeing where these resources were coming into the country. That was great fun trying to track those boats, and it even got the attention of several militaries around the world. So I did have the opportunity to sit down with some colonels and some captains and be like, here's a list of ships. Here's how we found them. Would you care to deal something with this? And the answer was yes, of course. And so you actually saw policy change around that. Now, when I came back to Canada and started teaching about that, you can only teach so much about it, and then students want to get involved with it. And so one of the things that we started to do was to reach out as a class assignment, work with some of the human rights groups who have got people on the ground in China who help shepherd North Koreans to safety. And as a class project, we actually spent our time raising funds to send to this group to help smuggle people out of North Korea. And where that money went, it went to paying for fuel for the buses, paying for shelter and accommodations, medical supplies, translators, forged Chinese documents, right? So when you're putting that together as a class project, and the university's like, you're raising money for what? Oh, we're just forging some Chinese documents. Don't worry about it. This is not your typical bake sale in the student union building. And in the end of it, we were able to get a family out of North Korea into Seoul. And was it a little bit loosey-goosey? Were some of the admins a little bit worried about what we were doing? Yeah, sure. But you know what? Let them sweat, because we actually helped somebody save their life, and students were directly involved in making that happen. So as a result, we've been one of the very few university classes to, basically take the regime head on, even from the comfort of our own classroom.
I see. I see that we have to step up our class projects. The level of our class projects, Harald.
Definitely, we have a lot to learn.
I think we have a lot to learn, and it's endlessly fascinating. And if you wanna check out more of Robert's work, you have your own podcast, right? The Global Development Primer is a great name.
That's it.
GDP.
You bet.
I love it. Go check it out. You'll find it on Spotify and all the other places you listen to podcasts. So thank you again, Robert. That was absolutely awesome.
Great. Thanks, guys. Really appreciate it.
Put your hair down.
Takk for at du hørte på Statsvitenskap og sånt. Har du spørsmål, kommentarer eller tilbakemelding, så er det bare å ta kontakt på vår Facebook-side, per e-post eller brevdue. Musikken er som vanlig laget av Robin Horvath, og Mats Halvorsen mikser og redigerer podcasten. Vi høres!